It was a bright afternoon when the annual music competition began in the small town's grand hall. People from different cities had gathered there, dressed neatly, carrying polished instruments and wearing confident smiles. The hall smelled of old wood and anticipation, and the stage lights made everything shimmer a little brighter than usual. Among the crowd stood an elderly woman. Her silver hair was tied in a low bun, and her hands, though wrinkled, held something carefully wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. She walked slowly, her steps small and quiet. People noticed her as she entered, and whispers started to spread around. "Who invited her?" Someone murmured near the door. "She's carrying that. What even is that?" Another person laughed softly. The old woman didn't respond. She simply smiled politely at everyone she passed and kept walking toward the registration desk. When her turn came, the young woman behind the desk looked surprised. "Ma'am, are you here to watch?" the clerk asked gently. The old woman shook her head. "No, dear. I'm here to play." The young clerk blinked, unsure what to say. Her eyes went to the bundle in the old woman's hands. "And what instrument will you be playing?" The woman slowly unwrapped the cloth, revealing an old wooden dulcimer. It looked handmade, with strings that had lost some shine and a few scratches along its surface. Yet there was something beautiful about it, something real and full of history. The clerk hesitated, then wrote down her name. "All right, you're on the list. Please wait in the performers' area." The old woman thanked her and quietly took a seat near the back. Around her, young musicians tuned their guitars and violins, ran fingers across piano keys, and whispered last-minute pep talks to themselves. A few of them looked at her and smiled politely, though some giggled, clearly amused by her presence. On the stage, the judges were getting ready. In the middle sat the famous Maestro, a tall man in his 50s known for his sharp words and even sharper ears. He had trained orchestras all over the world, and many feared his criticism more than they feared failure itself. Today he wore a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. When the competition began, one after another, performers stepped onto the stage. The hall filled with music, some pieces loud and full of showmanship, others soft and full of emotion. The maestro nodded or frowned, depending on what he heard. He rarely clapped. Hours passed until finally the host announced the next participant. "And now, we have a special entry. Please welcome Madame Lila." The hall grew silent for a moment as everyone looked toward the back. The old woman slowly rose from her chair, her dulcimer still in her hands. She walked toward the stage with small, careful steps. The sound of her shoes against the wooden floor echoed gently. As she reached the center of the stage, she placed the dulcimer on the table and adjusted the small wooden mallets she used to play. The maestro leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. He cleared his throat and spoke through the microphone. "Madam, may I ask what instrument that is?" "It's a dulcimer," she said with a smile. Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby. The maestro chuckled lightly, and the audience joined in with quiet laughter. "I see," he said. "We don't see many of those in competitions anymore. Are you sure you can manage?" The old woman looked up, her smile never fading. "I'll try my best, sir. That's all anyone can do." A few people in the audience snickered. A young man near the front whispered to his friend, "This will be fun." But the woman didn't seem to hear any of it. She gently closed her eyes, adjusted the dulcimer once more, and took a deep breath. For a moment the hall was silent again, an expectant silence almost too heavy to bear. Then she began to play. The first sound that came out was faint, like a whisper. Some people thought the instrument might not even work, but then the notes began to flow together, forming a gentle rhythm, one that seemed to carry the scent of distant memories. The melody was not loud or grand, it was tender, pure, and full of life. Her hands, though old, moved gracefully. Each strike of the mallet felt like a heartbeat. The tune rose and fell like waves, calm but powerful. Slowly, the laughter in the audience faded. The maestro, who had been smiling moments earlier, leaned forward slightly. His expression changed, curiosity replacing mockery. The dulcimer's sound filled the hall like sunlight through a window. It wasn't just music. It was a story told without words. It spoke of love and loss, of time passing gently, of promises that never faded. Every note seemed to carry emotion, and though nobody in the hall knew the story behind it, everyone felt it. The maestro's smile disappeared completely. His eyes began to soften and his breathing slowed. Something in that melody touched a place deep inside him, a memory he hadn't visited in years. It reminded him of a small house by the countryside, of his mother humming a tune by the fire as he fell asleep. The dulcimer's tone trembled slightly, as if carrying the sound of an old soul speaking directly to the heart. The audience sat still, afraid to even move. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. When the last note finally faded, there was a silence that lasted longer than anyone expected. The old woman didn't rush to bow or smile. She simply placed her mallets down and looked toward the judges, her eyes calm and kind. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a faint clap echoed from the back of the hall. Someone else joined, then another, until the entire hall stood up applauding. The sound was overwhelming, not because the performance was perfect, but because it was real. The maestro sat still for a few seconds, his hand covering his mouth. He blinked several times before finally joining in the applause. When the woman bowed and began to leave the stage, the maestro lifted the microphone again. "Madam," he said, his voice unsteady, "what was the name of that piece?" She stopped and looked back at him. "It doesn't have a name," she said softly. "It's just something my husband used to play for me when times were hard. I kept it with me all these years." The maestro nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment. The audience waited for his comment, expecting a clever remark or a formal critique. But he didn't give one. He simply said, "Thank you." The woman smiled and nodded before walking down from the stage, wrapping her dulcimer once again in its faded cloth. Backstage, a few younger musicians approached her, their earlier laughter gone. One of them said quietly, "That was beautiful, ma'am." She smiled again, her eyes shining. "Thank you, dear. I just play what my heart remembers." Meanwhile, the maestro remained seated, staring at the empty stage. His mind replayed the melody over and over like a forgotten memory awakening after years of silence. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt since his early days of learning music: humility. He turned to one of the other judges and whispered, "You heard that too, didn't you?" The other judge nodded, smiling faintly. "It's been a while since we've heard music like that." The maestro leaned back in his chair and looked toward the exit where the old woman had disappeared. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just sat there, lost in thought, feeling something deep in his chest, something that words couldn't quite explain. Outside the hall, the old woman walked slowly toward the bus stop. She hummed softly to herself, the same tune she had played on stage. The wind carried the sound gently through the air. Passers-by glanced at her and smiled without knowing why. For her, it wasn't about winning or losing. She hadn't come for the prize or the applause. She came because she wanted to keep her husband's music alive. And that evening, without realizing it, she had done something far greater. She reminded everyone, even the proud maestro, what real music truly meant. As the sun began to set and the town lights flickered on, the competition inside continued. But something had changed in the atmosphere. People no longer whispered or laughed at those who seemed different. The room felt lighter, warmer, as if her melody still lingered in the air, wrapping everyone in quiet peace. And though she didn't stay to see it, her name would be whispered again that night, spoken softly by musicians who suddenly remembered why they fell in love with music in the first place. When the evening ended, the old woman quietly left the hall. The night was calm, and the streetlights gave everything a soft golden glow. She held her dulcimer close to her chest as she walked home. There was no medal hanging from her neck, no certificate in her bag, yet her heart felt full. The memory of the people standing and clapping was more than enough. Inside the hall, the maestro was still sitting in his chair. Most of the audience had left, and the next performer was already waiting behind the curtain, but he didn't seem to notice. His mind was elsewhere. The melody kept replaying in his head again and again. It wasn't complex like the music he usually admired. It was simple, pure, and painfully beautiful. He finally stood up and walked backstage, pretending to check the schedule. But in truth, he wanted to see if the woman was still there. She was gone. Her name card still lay on the table, written in slightly shaky handwriting. He picked it up and stared at it for a long time. That night, when he returned home, the maestro couldn't sleep. He sat by his piano, touching the keys without pressing them. His house was large and filled with awards, framed newspaper articles, and old photos of concerts. Everything in the room screamed success, yet that night it all felt strangely empty. He tried to play something, but every note sounded wrong. His hands were technically perfect, but his heart wasn't in it. He stopped, sighed, and leaned back. Then, almost without thinking, he tried to replay the old woman's melody from memory. He pressed one key, then another, then another. Slowly, the sound began to form. It wasn't quite right. It was incomplete, like a story half forgotten. But as he played, something inside him began to stir. A feeling he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of a time long before fame, before applause, before pride. A time when music meant something different. His mind drifted back to his childhood. He remembered a small wooden house near a river. His mother used to sit by the window in the evenings, sewing or reading while he practiced his lessons. Sometimes when he grew tired, she would hum a gentle tune. It was always the same one, soft, warm, comforting. He never knew where she had learned it. And after she passed away, he never heard it again. Now, sitting in his grand house, he realized that the melody the old woman played sounded almost exactly like that same tune. It couldn't be a coincidence. The rhythm, the pauses, even the way the notes rose and fell, it was the same. He tried to recall the details, but the harder he thought, the fuzzier it became. He leaned forward and whispered to himself, how could she know that song? Meanwhile, across town, the old woman had reached her small home at the edge of the village. It was quiet there, surrounded by trees that rustled softly in the night wind. She placed her dulcimer carefully on the table and lit a small lamp. The soft glow filled the room, revealing photos of her late husband, an old man with kind eyes and a mischievous smile. She smiled back at the photo. You would have laughed at me today, she whispered. I took your old dulcimer to that big hall and people looked at me as if I were lost. But when I played your song, oh, the way they listened. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad ones. She sat beside the instrument, running her fingers gently over the strings. They felt warm from the performance earlier. She could still hear the applause, still see the surprised faces. She remembered the maestro's expression, that proud man who laughed when she first stepped on stage. His eyes had changed by the end of her song. She had seen something shift inside him. It was a look she knew well, the look of someone remembering something important they had forgotten long ago. The next morning, the maestro returned to the music academy he owned. Students greeted him politely as he passed through the corridors. He was known for his strictness and rarely smiled. But today, his face looked different. Not angry, not cold, just thoughtful. He entered the main hall where his assistant waited with a stack of papers. Good morning, Maestro. We have a list of students for the next recital. He nodded absently, not really listening. His eyes wandered toward the piano standing in the corner. Without saying anything, he walked over and sat down. His assistant looked confused. Sir, do you want to begin rehearsal? The maestro shook his head slowly. No. I just want to remember something. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play the melody again, the one the old woman had performed. This time he played it softly, almost like a whisper. A few students passing by stopped near the door, surprised. They had never heard him play something so gentle. When he finished, he looked up and saw a few of them watching. Do any of you know this song? He asked. They shook their heads. One of the students said, It's beautiful, sir. Did you write it? The maestro smiled faintly. No, he said. Someone far wiser did. After class, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He wanted to find her again, to ask where she had learned that melody. Something told him that it held an answer. Maybe to his past, maybe to something deeper he had lost along the way. He contacted the competition organizers and asked for her address. At first, they hesitated, saying it might be private. But after explaining his reason, they agreed to send a letter on his behalf. He wrote carefully in his neat handwriting, Dear Madam, your music has not left my mind. It awakened something I thought I had lost. If you would allow me, I wish to visit you and learn more about your song. With respect, Victor. Days passed. He waited impatiently, checking his mail every morning. Finally, a small envelope arrived. Inside was a note written in shaky letters. Dear Maestro, I am surprised you remembered me. You are welcome to visit if your heart wishes to listen, not to judge. The dulcimer is always ready. Lila. The next day, he took the first train to the small village mentioned in the letter. When he arrived, the air smelled of earth and blooming flowers. Children played by the roadside, waving as he walked by. It felt nothing like the city. He followed the directions until he reached a small wooden house with ivy climbing the walls. An old woman was sitting on the porch mending a piece of cloth. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled. "I see you found your way," she said. He nodded politely. "Thank you for inviting me. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Would you like some tea?" He accepted, and she went inside for a moment. When she returned, she carried 2 cups and the dulcimer. She placed it gently on the table between them. For a few moments, they sat quietly. The maestro looked at the instrument closely. Up close, it was even more beautiful. The wood darkened by age, the carvings detailed, every mark telling a story. He spoke softly. "That melody you played, I've been thinking about it every day. My mother used to hum a tune almost exactly like that when I was a child. I haven't heard it in decades." The woman looked at him with kind eyes. "Then perhaps your mother knew my husband's song," she said. "He used to share his music freely. He believed songs belonged to hearts, not to people." Her words made the maestro pause. "Did your husband write it?" "Yes," she said, smiling faintly. "He wrote it for me when times were hard. We didn't have much, but that tune kept us together. He said, as long as we can play this song, we'll never feel alone." The maestro's throat tightened. "He was right," he whispered. She placed her hand gently over the strings. "Music isn't about how perfect it sounds," she said softly. "It's about how honest it feels. I think that's why you remembered it." The maestro nodded slowly. He realized she was right. For years he had focused only on technique, on fame, on applause. But somewhere along the way he had lost the very thing that made music alive: emotion. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about music, about life, about how songs carry memories when words fail. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the porch. When it was time for him to leave, he stood up and looked at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've reminded me of something precious." She smiled warmly. Then my husband's song did what it was meant to do. As he walked back toward the station, the wind carried the sound of the dulcimer once again. She was playing the same melody, gentle and full of love. The maestro stopped for a moment and closed his eyes. He didn't need to see her to feel the music. It wrapped around him like sunlight, soft and forgiving. For the first time in many years, he felt peace. The following weeks passed quietly, yet the maestro found himself changed in ways he couldn't quite explain. Every morning, when he entered the academy, the first thing he did was sit by the piano and let his fingers wander across the keys. He no longer started with scales or drills like he used to. Instead, he began with that soft melody, the one the old woman had played. It had become part of him now, echoing in his thoughts even when no instrument was near. His students noticed the change too. He no longer barked instructions or criticized small mistakes with cold precision. Instead, he listened. When a student played with heart but missed a note, he smiled and said, "Don't stop. Keep the feeling alive." For the first time, they saw a warmth in him they hadn't seen before. But late at night, when he was alone, that melody brought something else. Memories he had buried long ago. He would sit by the piano with the lights dimmed and close his eyes. Then, like a gentle breeze, the past would return. He saw himself as a little boy sitting on the floor beside his mother's chair. The fire crackled softly, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the house. His mother's hands were busy sewing, yet her lips hummed that same tune. It was her way of telling him everything would be all right, even during the hardest times. He remembered one night in particular. It was raining heavily outside. Their roof leaked in 2 places, and his mother had placed bowls beneath the drops. She had smiled at him and said, "Don't be afraid, little one. Listen to the rhythm. Even rain has music in it." Then she had started humming that same song, and he had fallen asleep to its sound. Years later, when he left home to study music in the city, she hugged him tightly and said, "Don't forget where your song began." He had promised her he wouldn't. But as fame and success came, the memory of her song slowly faded, replaced by grander, louder compositions that filled concert halls, but never his heart. Now, as he replayed that tune in his head, he felt tears sting his eyes. He realized how far he had drifted from the reason he began loving music in the first place. One evening, he decided to return to his hometown. It had been over 20 years since he last visited. The journey took hours, but he didn't mind. As the train moved through green fields and quiet villages, he felt something inside him soften. When he arrived, the station looked smaller than he remembered, but the air smelled the same, fresh, earthy, full of life. He walked through the narrow streets, passing familiar corners that stirred memories. The bakery where his mother used to buy bread was still there, though the sign had faded. The river behind their old house still shimmered under the evening sun. When he reached the small cottage, he stopped and took a deep breath. The door and windows were broken, the garden wild with weeds, but he could almost hear her voice in the wind. He sat down on a stone near the door and closed his eyes. For a moment he imagined she was still there, humming softly while tending her plants. He whispered, "I remembered the song, Mama." The words trembled in the air, and he felt something lift from his heart. Back in the village where the old woman lived, she too often thought of him. Sometimes when she sat by the porch playing her dulcimer, she wondered if he had found what he was looking for. She didn't expect to see him again, but she hoped the music had reached wherever it needed to go. A few days later, while she was watering the plants outside her home, she heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up and saw him standing there, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. "You came back," she said, smiling. He nodded. "I had to. I went home, to my mother's house. It's empty now, but I heard her song again. I think your husband's tune was the same one she used to sing." She nodded gently, her eyes kind. "Songs travel, Maestro. They pass from one heart to another. Maybe your mother heard it somewhere, or maybe the world gave it to both of us. Some melodies aren't owned, they just live through us." He sat down beside her on the porch, placing the flowers on the small table. "You know," he said softly, "when I was younger, I thought music was about being perfect, about being. I wanted every note to impress people, but now I see that real music is supposed to comfort, to remind people of what they've lost or what they still have." The old woman smiled. "That's what my husband always said. He believed music was a bridge between souls. He built this dulcimer with his own hands, and every time he played, he'd tell me that it wasn't just wood and strings. It was a memory." The maestro looked at the instrument and reached out to touch it. The surface felt smooth, but he could sense the years it had seen, the joy, the sorrow, the countless songs that had passed through it. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He picked up the mallets awkwardly at first, but she guided his hands. "Gently," she said. "Let the sound come to you." He began to play slowly. The first few notes were uneven, but then something shifted. His fingers found a rhythm, his heart found its beat. The dulcimer's tone filled the air, soft, shimmering, alive. Birds perched on the nearby fence seemed to listen. The woman closed her eyes, smiling. When he finished, he let the last note fade naturally into the wind. "It feels different," he whispered. "It's not like playing a piano, it feels alive." "That's because you're not just playing an instrument," she said quietly. "You're remembering." He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Maybe that's what music really is, a way to remember the people who made us who we are." She nodded. "Yes. And when you play from that place, it touches others, even strangers. That's what you did in that hall the night you listened. You didn't just hear me, you heard yourself." He smiled gently. "You know, I've taught hundreds of students, but I think this lesson might be the one that will stay with me forever." They talked for hours after that. She told him stories about her husband, their early days together, how they would play music by the firelight, and how even when times were tough, one song could make everything feel bearable. He listened, not as a maestro or a critic, but as a human being, feeling every word. When the sky began to turn orange, he stood up. "Would you come to the city?" he asked. "I'd like my students to hear your music. They need to know that talent is not about speed or perfection, it's about soul." She laughed softly. "I'm too old for big stages now, I'm happy where I am." He hesitated, then said, "At least promise me one thing. Promise that you'll keep playing. Because that song, it still has work to do in this world." She nodded with a smile. I promise. Before leaving, he looked around the little porch one more time. It wasn't grand or decorated, but it felt warmer than any concert hall he had ever stood in. As he walked away, he heard the dulcimer. Again, the same melody, the same feeling, and he realized something that made him stop and smile. He wasn't just hearing her song anymore. He was hearing his mother's voice in it, whispering through time, telling him she was proud. When he returned to the city, his students noticed the change again. His music classes were different now. Instead of rigid lessons, he began each session by saying, "Close your eyes. Feel the sound before you play it." He told them stories about small places and simple instruments, about how greatness doesn't always come wrapped in shine and polish. Sometimes it hides in an old woman's song waiting to be heard. One day, as he was finishing a class, a young girl raised her hand. "Maestro," she asked shyly, "what is the most beautiful sound you've ever heard?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "It wasn't from a famous orchestra or a perfect performance," he said softly. "It was from someone who played with her heart, not her hands." That night, when he was alone in the hall, he sat by the piano and began to play again. But this time, he didn't just play the melody. He felt it. Every note carried warmth, forgiveness, and peace. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about gratitude. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to his mother, the old woman, or both. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that their music had met somewhere in his heart and changed him forever. Outside the academy, the wind rustled the trees softly, almost as if it too was humming that same forgotten melody, one that had traveled from soul to soul, across time, across silence, reminding the world that real music never dies. The days after his visit to the old woman passed in a quiet but restless blur for the maestro. He went through his routines at the academy, conducting classes, listening to students, correcting mistakes, yet nothing felt the same. Every performance, every note, every student he observed reminded him of that dulcimer, of the gentle tune that had shaken something deep inside him. He tried to ignore it at first. After all, he was a maestro, a teacher of music, a man of discipline. There was no place for longing or memory in his professional life. Yet each morning when he woke, that same melody came back, like the echo of a distant river he had once known, flowing through him and refusing to leave. One afternoon, after a particularly long rehearsal, he stayed behind while the students filed out. The hall was empty now, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint echo of footsteps. He approached the grand piano at the center, his hands hovering over the keys but not pressing them. He closed his eyes and let the memory of the dulcimer fill him. He could almost see the old woman sitting on her porch, the sun falling across her silver hair, the gentle motion of her hands over the strings. He could almost hear the wind carrying the melody across the village, across the fields, into his very soul. The first notes he pressed were shaky, imperfect. He didn't care. He allowed himself to remember, to feel, to be a child again, sitting by the fire listening to his mother hum. As he played, tears began to gather in his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had pushed aside. Loneliness, regret, lost time, the years he had spent chasing applause rather than meaning. When he finally stopped, the room was silent except for the sound of his own breathing. He remained seated, head bowed, hands trembling. The music had unlocked something he hadn't known was still inside him. A quiet, aching sorrow that came from realizing how much he had missed, how far he had drifted from the music that once made him whole. The next day, he found himself unable to focus on teaching. He watched his students, young and eager, and yet he could see how many of them were chasing perfection, not feeling. He remembered the applause from the hall, the quiet joy on the old woman's face, the softness in the way she had played. He realized that what they were all missing wasn't technique or precision. It was heart. By evening, he packed a small bag and left the city. He needed to see her again. He needed to hear the music in its pure form, to understand fully what had awakened something so profound within him. The train ride back to the village felt longer than before, but every mile he traveled made him feel lighter. He was returning to something essential, something he hadn't realized he had been missing for all these years. When he arrived at the village, the streets were calm, and the familiar smells of earth, flowers, and smoke greeted him. He walked slowly, savoring the air, the memories, the quiet peace. The old house with ivy on the walls appeared just as it had the last time he saw it. She was on the porch, sitting with her dulcimer in her lap, humming softly. She looked up, surprised, but then smiled warmly. "You came back," she said simply. He nodded, taking a small step forward. "I had to. I couldn't stop thinking about the music, about everything it reminded me of." She gestured to a chair beside her. "Sit. Play with me if you wish." He hesitated for a moment, then placed the bag beside him and took the mallets. He wasn't sure he remembered the exact notes, but he knew the feeling. That was all that mattered. As he played, she joined him softly at first, matching the rhythm he had found. The melody grew, not loud or grand, but intimate, full of the memories of all the lives it had touched. When they stopped, they didn't speak immediately. They sat quietly, listening to the faint wind rustling the trees. Then softly he said, "I didn't realize how much I needed this. I thought I had everything, fame, recognition, but it was hollow without this, without feeling." She nodded. "Many people think music is only about skill, but it is much more. Music is memory, love, longing. It reminds us of the people we have lost, the people we love, the moments that mattered. Your heart remembered, Maestro, even if your mind forgot." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "When I played it alone at the academy, I couldn't stop crying. I hadn't felt anything like that in years. It's strange how one simple song could open everything inside me." "It is not strange," she said softly. "It is the way the world works. Music travels through the soul before it travels through the ears. It finds what is hidden." He remained quiet for a long moment, letting her words sink in. Then with a sudden honesty he asked, "Do you ever feel lonely playing alone all these years?" Her eyes softened and she smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But I have the music and it has never left me. Sometimes I feel the presence of those who have gone, and I hear their voices in the tune. I have always known that music is never truly alone, just as the memories of love are never truly gone." He nodded, understanding completely. For the first time in decades, he felt a connection that had nothing to do with skill or reputation, but everything to do with life, with humanity, with the stories embedded in every note. For hours they shared stories of their lives, their joys, their losses, their regrets. He spoke of the concerts, the awards, the grand halls filled with applause. She spoke of her husband, of quiet evenings by the fire, of music that lived in memory and in heart rather than in fame. At one point, he found himself saying something he hadn't admitted in years. "I have been proud of my skill, proud of my accomplishments, but all that feels small now. I see it wasn't about what I could do, it was about what I could feel and share. And I missed it for so long." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Then it is good that you remembered. That is why music brought you here to this moment." The maestro nodded, feeling a quiet release. Tears ran down his cheeks, unashamed, unbidden. He had not cried like this since he was a boy. Sitting by his mother's chair, hearing her hum the same tune he had almost forgotten. The dulcimer sat between them, a humble instrument. Yet it had done something greater than all the grand pianos, violins, and orchestras in the world. He realized then that the old woman had given him more than music. She had given him himself. The part of him that had loved for love's sake, that had felt deeply before ambition, before pride, before judgment. That part of him had been asleep, and now it had awakened. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they had played together many times. Each melody was slightly different, shaped by memory, by mood, by heart. The maestro knew he could never play this way alone. It needed the connection, the story, the life behind the notes. When it was finally time for him to leave, he stood slowly, brushing his tears away. "I don't think I can ever thank you enough," he said. "You already have," she said, smiling. "By remembering, by feeling, by letting it change you. That is all that matters." He nodded, taking one last look at the small cottage, the porch, the dulcimer resting gently in her lap. As he walked back to the village station, he felt something new: humility. For the first time in his life, he understood that being a maestro wasn't about praise or recognition. It was about heart, soul, and memory. The train ride back to the city was quiet. He didn't play music on the train, nor did he speak much. He simply sat, letting the experience sink in. He knew that when he returned to the academy, his teaching would never be the same. He would teach differently, not because he had to, but because he now knew what truly mattered. That night, as he finally returned to his apartment in the city, he placed the old melody at the forefront of his mind. He wrote down a few notes in a journal he had long ignored. Each line reminded him that music was not a path to fame but a bridge to memory, to love, to connection. He didn't know if he would ever see the old woman again, but he knew it didn't matter. The music had become a part of him, and in that way she would always be with him. As he lay in bed that night, the city lights outside his window twinkling softly, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he slept peacefully, his heart full, his spirit lighter, and his soul renewed by a simple melody carried by a humble instrument. The maestro returned to the academy the following morning, carrying with him a quiet sense of purpose. The air inside the hall felt different to him now. The polished wood, the grand instruments, the shining trophies, all of it still existed, yet none of it mattered as much as it had the day before. The music he had learned from the old woman had changed him, opened his eyes to something far deeper than applause or perfection. As students arrived for their lessons, he greeted them with a smile he had not worn in years. They noticed the change immediately. He no longer looked like the unapproachable figure of authority they were used to. His steps were lighter, his voice gentler, and there was a softness in his eyes that made students feel at ease. For many, it was the first time they had seen him truly human, not just a maestro of music. He began his morning session with a simple instruction. Today we are not going to worry about scales, timing, or flawless technique. Today we are going to feel. Close your eyes. Listen to what your heart wants to play. At first, the students hesitated. Some exchanged uncertain glances. They were used to strict rules, to being corrected at every turn. But his tone carried an authority different from the usual command. It was an invitation, not a demand. Slowly, one by one, they picked up their instruments and began to play. Some notes were wrong, some chords awkward, but something remarkable happened. The music began to sound alive. The room, usually filled with the mechanical precision of practice, now hummed with warmth, with connection. The maestro walked among them, nodding, offering encouragement. "Good," he said. "Feel it more. Let it breathe." By afternoon, the academy's principal stopped by to see what was different. He found the maestro sitting among his students, laughing softly at a minor mistake. For a man who had spent decades cultivating perfection, the sight was almost unbelievable. "Victor," the principal said carefully, "what is happening here? You are," smiling, "encouraging them to make mistakes." The maestro looked up, his eyes calm. "They are not mistakes," he said. "They are music, it is real. And when music is real, it touches hearts. That is the only thing that matters." The principal shook his head, partly bewildered, partly impressed. He had never seen the maestro like this, and yet he could feel the truth in the words. Later that week, the maestro decided it was time to bring the old woman into his world, not just as a memory, not just as a teacher of melodies, but as a living example of the heart behind music. He picked up the phone and called her. The first few rings carried the weight of hesitation. Finally she answered. "Hello," she said softly. "It's me," he said, his voice steady. "I want to bring you to the academy, to play for my students, to show them what music really is." There was silence for a moment. Then she laughed gently, a warm, melodic sound. "You have changed," she said. "Are you sure you are ready for that?" He smiled. "Yes, I want them to hear the truth, and I want to hear it again myself." 2 days later, she arrived at the academy, walking slowly but with a quiet dignity. Students crowded near the door, curious and awed by her presence. They had heard stories about the famous maestro, but this was something different. A woman with an old instrument carrying history and memory in her hands. The maestro greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming. Today you will teach them something no sheet music ever could." She smiled, placing the dulcimer on the table. She looked around at the young faces, some skeptical, some eager. "Music is not about speed," she said. "It is not about applause. It is about life. Let me show you." When she began to play, the room fell silent. At first the notes were soft, almost fragile, but soon they grew into a melody that filled every corner. A melody rich with memory, with emotion, with the kind of truth that could not be measured by technique. Students stopped trying to analyze, stopped thinking about precision, and simply listened. The maestro watched them closely. He could see their eyes widen, their shoulders relax, their hearts opening. For many of them, it was the first time they realized music could speak beyond notes and rhythm. It could tell a story, convey a feeling, awaken something long buried. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause. The silence was too deep, too full of awe. Then slowly, one student began to clap. Another followed. Within moments, the entire room was applauding, some wiping tears from their eyes. The maestro felt his own eyes sting. He had taught thousands of students, conducted hundreds of performances, yet this moment was unlike any other. It was pure. It was honest. It was life itself captured in sound. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must confess, tonight I came as a teacher, but I leave as a student. This woman has reminded me of the most important lesson in music and perhaps in life. Music is not about showing off. Music is about remembering, about feeling, about sharing a piece of your heart with the world." The old woman looked at him, her eyes shining. "He remembers now," she said softly, "and that is enough." That evening, the students left the academy filled with inspiration, talking quietly about the lesson they had learned. Some practiced their instruments with renewed purpose, not to impress but to feel. Some sat alone, replaying the melody in their minds, realizing that music could carry their own memories, their own emotions, in ways they had never imagined. The maestro stayed behind, alone with the old woman. "I cannot thank you enough," he said. "You have done more for me in a few hours than I have achieved in decades." She shook her head gently. "It was never about you alone. Music belongs to everyone. You have only remembered how to listen." He nodded, realizing she was right. He had been so focused on teaching, on technique, on accolades, that he had forgotten the heart of music. And now, because of her, he remembered. Days turned into weeks, and the old woman continued to visit the academy, teaching students not only how to play, but how to feel. Each session was different, intimate, personal, and each time the maestro watched and learned, rediscovering the joy of music he had lost so long ago. One afternoon, after a long session, he finally spoke the words he had held inside. "I see now," he said. "I have been proud of my skill, my fame, my accomplishments. But all of that pales in comparison to what I felt today, what I hear when you play. Humility, heart, that is what matters. That is what lasts." The old woman smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Yes, and when you teach your students this, they will carry it forward. The melody doesn't end with you. It will live in them and in all the hearts it touches." For the maestro, it was a revelation. He realized that the greatest gift he could give was not perfection, not technique, not applause. It was honesty, vulnerability, the courage to play from the heart. And through this, he understood that the old woman's presence was not only a gift to his students, but to himself. That night, after the academy emptied and the last lights were turned off, he sat alone at the piano, replaying the melody once more. But this time it was different. The notes no longer carried just memory, they carried gratitude. They carried the love he had for music itself, for life, for the people who had shaped him. He played slowly, letting every note breathe. Every chord reminded him of the old woman's hands on the dulcimer, of the wind carrying the tune through the village, of his mother humming softly in the past. He realized that he had found something deeper than he had ever sought, a connection that transcended skill, fame, or recognition. When he finally stopped, he rested his hands on the keys and exhaled deeply. He knew that this was only the beginning. From now on, every note he played, every student he taught, every performance he conducted would be touched by this lesson: humility, heart, feeling. This was the true essence of music. And somewhere in the distance, he imagined the old woman smiling, knowing that her melody had reached far beyond what either of them could have imagined. He had learned to listen, to feel, to share. And in doing so, he had discovered the true gift of music, the gift that could never be taught in a textbook or learned through perfection, the gift of humility and the courage to play with heart. The maestro awoke that morning with a quiet determination he had never known before. The memory of the old woman's dulcimer, her gentle teaching, and the lessons of humility and heart had stayed with him, nestled deep within his chest like a steady, pulsing rhythm. Today he would take a step he had long avoided, Not for fame, not for recognition, but because his heart insisted it was the right thing to do. He arrived at the academy early, before any students had come in. The sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, illuminating the dust particles that danced like tiny sparks in the air. He ran his hands lightly over the keys of the grand piano, feeling their smooth, familiar surface, and he remembered the dulcimer's rougher, warmer touch. He remembered the sound that had changed him, and he felt a small, grateful smile tug at the corners of his lips. The students began arriving one by one. Today was different. He had called a special session and had asked them to leave their expectations behind. As they gathered in the hall, curious whispers filled the air. Some of them noticed the glow in his eyes, a quiet excitement that seemed to hum beneath the surface. "Sit down, everyone," he said softly, gesturing to the chairs. "Today I am not here as your teacher. I am here as someone who has learned a new lesson about music, about life, about what it truly means to play from the heart." There was a silence, a pause as the students tried to process what he meant. Then slowly he pulled from his bag a small worn instrument, the dulcimer, the same one the old woman had brought into his life weeks ago. It looked simple, unassuming, almost fragile, yet it carried within it decades of history, memory, and love. "This," he said, holding it up gently, "is more than an instrument. It is a teacher, a messenger. It has traveled through hearts, through time, and it has brought me here. Today it will speak to you." He placed the dulcimer carefully on the table and began to play. At first the students were cautious, unsure how to react. The notes were soft, delicate, yet each one vibrated with something far beyond their technical value. As the melody flowed, the students began to feel it, not just hear it. It was music they could sense in their bones, a story told not with words but with life itself. When he finished, the room was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Then slowly one student whispered, "It's beautiful." Another added, "It feels like home." The maestro smiled. "That is exactly it. Music can bring us home even if we've been lost for years. It reminds us of the people we love, the moments we've lived, and the parts of ourselves we may have forgotten. Today I want you all to remember that when you play, don't just hit the notes, feel them. Let them tell your story." Over the next several hours, he guided his students not with corrections but with encouragement. Some played awkwardly. Some stumbled over the simplest chords, yet he never interrupted them harshly. Instead, he listened, offered a word, a nod, a small smile, and let the music grow naturally. Slowly, the hall filled with sound that was messy but alive, imperfect yet honest. He noticed something remarkable. The students began to share with each other, not just music but stories. They told each other about the songs their parents had played, the lullabies their siblings had hummed, the tunes that reminded them of home. Music had become a bridge, connecting not only the maestro and the students but each of the young hearts in that room. By late afternoon, the old woman herself arrived. She had agreed to return one last time, not as a teacher but as a witness to the change she had inspired. When she walked in, the students quieted, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The maestro greeted her warmly and gestured toward the hall. "They've learned something remarkable," he said softly. "Not from me but from you. From what you taught me. I wanted you to see the difference your music has made." She nodded, her eyes bright. "Music always finds its way, Maestro. I only opened a door. You walked through it. They will too." When she began to play even more softly than before, the room seemed to hold its breath. The students closed their eyes, and one by one they felt the melody wrap around them like a gentle hand, guiding them through memories and emotions they had long kept hidden. The maestro joined her, playing alongside, feeling the dulcimer's warmth against his hands, hearing the harmony between their instruments, feeling for the first time that music was not about him, or about perfection but about connection. Time passed unnoticed. When the melody finally ended, tears glimmered on several young faces. The maestro looked around, his own eyes damp. He realized that in teaching humility, heart, and feeling, he had learned the final, most important lesson himself. Greatness is not measured by skill or applause, but by the ability to touch another's soul. The students began to clap softly, but this time it was different. There was no pride, no showmanship. It was genuine gratitude, the acknowledgement of something far greater than themselves. And in that moment, the maestro felt the truth he had always sought but had never truly understood until now. As evening approached, The old woman rose to leave. She turned to the maestro, her expression gentle but filled with meaning. "Remember," she said, "this music, this lesson, this gift, it lives inside you. It does not end here. It travels with every note you play, with every heart you touch. Teach them, share it, and it will never be lost." The maestro nodded. "I will. Thank you. For everything." She smiled one last time, the sunlight catching her silver hair like a halo. "Go. Play with love. Always." After she left, the maestro remained in the hall long into the night. He sat at the piano, replaying the melody in every possible variation. He thought of his mother, of the old woman, of every student who had listened, every note that had been played. The music was no longer just sound, it was memory, connection, life itself. He realized that he would never be the same. Fame and accolades had once defined him, but now he understood that they were empty without heart. He thought about the thousands of performances he had given, the trophies he had won, the critics who had praised him, and he smiled quietly. Those things were fleeting, but music that came from the soul, music that carried memory and meaning, that lived in the hearts of others, that was eternal. The maestro decided that from that day on, he would dedicate himself differently. He would continue teaching, of course, but his focus would not be on perfection. It would be on connection, on emotion, on the human experience. Each student who passed through his academy would carry a piece of this lesson, this melody, forward into the world. And through them, the old woman's music and the memory of his own mother would live on. Weeks later, the maestro received a letter in the mail. It was from the old woman, simple and elegant. It read, "Dear Maestro, I heard your students playing today. I could feel their hearts. Thank you for remembering what matters. Music will always find its way, and now it has many more hands to guide it. Keep playing and keep sharing. With love, Lila." He held the letter close, feeling a warmth in his chest that no applause or award had ever given him. He placed it on the piano beside the dulcimer and whispered softly, "I will." From that day forward, the academy changed. Students played with heart, not for recognition. Teachers learned to listen, not just to correct. Visitors remarked on the warmth of the place, the life in the music, the honesty in the sound. And everywhere the melody, the simple, humble song that had changed one maestro's heart, echoed, quietly but powerfully, touching every soul that encountered it. Years later, when people spoke of the maestro, they did not remember him for his awards, his fame, or his perfection. They remembered him for the way he made music matter, for the way he taught hearts before notes, for the way he remembered what many had forgotten. That music is alive, it carries memory, it connects, it heals, and it never truly dies. And somewhere in a small village far from the city, the old woman played her dulcimer, smiling to herself, knowing that her simple song had changed the world in ways she could never measure. Because the melody had found its home, not in a concert hall, but in hearts, warm, alive, and forever remembered. The maestro played too, every day with new students, with friends, with strangers. And every time he lifted his hands to the keys, he felt the dulcimer, the village, the mother, and the lesson all in one. Music is love. Music is memory. Music is life. And when played from the heart, it can never be forgotten.